Hello and welcome to Iowa's Electric Generation Condition of the State 2023 presentation. My name is Marshall James. I am a representative of the Iowa Environmental Council. Today we're going to be presenting our Condition of the State report, which is a survey of what the energy landscape looks like in Iowa and what are the challenges and opportunities to bring Iowa to 100% clean energy. The Iowa Environmental Council is the largest environmental coalition in the state of Iowa, representing over 100 organizations, advocating at all levels of government for cleaner water, clean energy, and environmental justice initiatives. Our presenter today is our Energy Policy Counsel here at IEC, Steve Geyer. We are very grateful to have Steve on staff here as a man who can really understand and parse a lot of the hard science that goes into the research that is compiled in our report every year. He's integral to its creation and to updating our numbers every year. And so we really couldn't ask for a better presenter to be speaking about what the energy mix is like here in Iowa. But before we get started, it's important to make sure that there's a baseline understanding of climate change, what it is and the risks it poses to Iowans, to try and push back on misinformation that has spread around. So carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels are the main drivers of climate change. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of all forms of fossil fuel and especially coal combustion. As a rule of thumb, coal generation produces approximately 2,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. Natural gas fire generation produces about half of that at 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. So coal, at this point, we know the science is clear. It is by far the most polluting form of fossil fuel combustion, and fossil fuel combustion is the most polluting form of greenhouse gas emissions on Earth.
So what are the impacts? Certainly, I think an understanding needs to be held in terms of climate change and what the impacts are. This is not basically talking about, for instance, just seeing warmer weather. Weather patterns are changing as a result of climate change. So anything from rising temperatures, which we're seeing, to droughts, to certainly we can look to some of the wildfires as an outcome of that. But we're seeing this in Iowa. And so in Iowa, certainly the derecho in 2020 should have been an indication that we are going to see this in the future. Predictions are that we may see an increasing number of these types of events over the next decade. But that event alone was $12 billion in damage in just one event, and then followed quickly on that in 2021 with a first ever derecho, basically in December. Had 61 reported tornadoes associated with that, and that was over $1 billion in damage. So we are seeing the impacts from climate change already. So to address this, what are the targets that have been set? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we'll just refer to it as IPCC from here on through the presentation, continues to put out reports, but put out a report in April of 22 that said if we needed to limit and should limit CO2 to basically the increase in temperatures to 1.5 degrees C, then we have to decrease our coal generation. The target was set 82% from 2019 by 2030, and recognize that's at a global level. That's not talking about countries that have the ability to do it faster than that and more readily than that. And so the US, in terms of our national policy, then to conform to that goal, was set and said that we have to be able to eliminate coal generation and fossil gas generation by 2035, and in fact, set 2030 as the date when we should be able to and should eliminate coal generation if we want to meet that standard. Importantly, the IPCC sets out a net zero standard. And so that means that for every ton of CO2 or greenhouse gas, for that matter, that goes into the atmosphere, we have to have some way of then removing that equal amount in order for us to stabilize and come back at a point where we don't see an increase in temperature rises. And very important in this is recognizing that different sectors uh, basically are going to take more time, and importantly, getting the sectors in an order that not only has the ability then to meet that standard, but is required to meet that standard is important. And so if we can't get to carbon-free electricity by 2035, then all the other sectors, whether it's transportation, whether it is the building sector, will not be able to meet that goal, and we won't be able to meet a goal of 2050. So it's imperative that we look at energy as sort of a very first portion of this overall transition, again, to meet that standard. So what does Iowa contribute to climate change? So since 2005, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources has been tracking our climate change, our impacts of climate change, by looking at our greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And so as we look at this in terms of what is 2021, by the way, 2021, because I'll just say part of the unfortunate aspect is even though 2022 is already in the books, we won't actually see the 2022 results until the end of 2023. So this is always going to be a lagging look, basically looking backwards in time, as opposed to already being past what 2022 was. But even in 2021, you will note that the largest impact comes from agriculture, followed by, and they characterize it as residential, commercial, industrial, but think of that just as that's in essence talking about your building sector. And in essence, it's talking about the building sector and what amounts to heating and air conditioning in those buildings, followed by power plants, following up at 19% in terms of those are your top three contributors then in Iowa to climate change, or in this case, certainly the greenhouse gas emissions. So I mentioned from 2005. So this is what it has looked like as DNR has tracked it. I think it's important to look at this in terms of where progress has been made, but again, pointing out this overall aspect until we actually can get the generation and the power sector down, we really can't make much progress on the other sectors. Importantly, transportation and the building sector, you'll notice from 2005 to 2021, they not only have made no progress, but in fact, they've pretty much increased since that point in time. I'll just say, importantly, our generation sector certainly has decreased, and it needs to, again, because they're sequential. One has to basically occur before the other. The other ones you'll notice at the bottom don't have a tremendous amount of impact, but you also notice they really haven't changed over time from, again, 2005 to 2021. Although industrial processes have increased some. But again, even there, that is something that needs to look at electrification to actually reduce that portion. So let's shift over to the power plants and the contribution that they make to climate change. Although we've seen in Iowa a decline over the past 15 years, again, the other sectors have not basically seen much improvement at all, if not increasing. Back to this, reinforcing this concept to get to net zero by 2050. That building sector, the transportation sector, they are relying on electrification in order to meet the standard of being carbon free and being basically net zero by 2050. But to do that, we have to have carbon free electricity sector by 2035, especially in both of those sectors, by the way, transportation and building sector. Will deal with the issue of rolling over existing stock. And so whether it's the automobiles we have out there today or the buildings we have today, that's going to take time. Even with electrification and even with basically a zero carbon electricity sector, it'll take time to get those to a point where they actually meet that net zero standard. But to do that, our utilities have to get on board with this overall concept of being zero carbon electricity again by 2035. So where is the coal generation in Iowa? So I like to put this map up. This is the name of the plants. And so to give you some sense, if you don't know where these are location-wise, so the Neal plants are up just south of Sioux City. The Walter Scott plants are in Council Bluffs. The Prairie Creek Forest Station is over in Cedar Rapids. The Louisa station is just outside of Muscatine, and the Ottumwa station is just outside of Ottumwa. And so the point I want to make here is, again, back to this aspect of limiting basically to 1.5 degrees C. So in that same IPCC report that I was referring to, they said in the report that in order to meet that standard, and when we look at the worldwide fleet of coal, that overall we need to retire, or would have to retire, coal plants 23 years sooner than their expected lifetimes, and gas plants 17 years sooner than expected lifetimes. When you put it into context in terms of what does that mean for these plants, it means that in order to even meet that 2-degree rise standard, only Walter Scott 4 should have been operating past today, past 2023, and that all the others to meet that standard should have been closed by this point in time. So something that we haven't actually shown before, and so the plants generically get referred to by the operator of the plant. And so out of those 6 plants on there, 2 of them were identified, the Prairie Creek and the Ottumwa, as being operated by Alliant Energy, and the others were identified as Mid-American. But that's ownership and operation are in fact 2 different things. And so Mid-American ends up being the operator of 5 out of those 6 you see there on the screen, with only Alliant actually having operational control of Ottumwa, and explaining how this comes to be. And how did we get here? Well, when power plants were built, you'll notice that almost every single one of them, in fact, is what's called a joint owned unit. In other words, it has more owners than one owner. And so when they were built, the way that the process worked was whoever the largest owner was took operational responsibility for those plants. And so in this case, the Neal plants, the Liza plant, Walter Scott plants were all deemed to be Mid-American plants because they had the largest ownership interest. On the other hand, Ottumwa is sort of an anomaly where, given the various mergers that occurred over time, when the plant was built, Iowa Southern Utilities, which actually eventually became a part of Alliant, was the largest owner of the plant. And so operating control ended up being on at the time, Iowa Southern, eventually became Alliant, even though they have a smaller ownership interest in the plant. But the thing I want to point out here is that through joint ownership, it's not just the 2 investor-owned utilities that have a part in Iowa's coal generation. You have the RECs, and as you'll notice on there, many of the municipals that also have ownership in the various plants. And so when I go to the next slide, because you're not going to necessarily know, well, what does that mean if it's 2.5% for Cedar Falls utilities? If I add up all those percentages of all the plants, then I end up with this. And so we can sort of see, well, what type of ownership do we have among the RECs or among the municipals, among the investor owns? And so they were color coded. And certainly Alliant and Mid-American have the largest shares of that generation, with Mid-American, frankly, having something that is far greater in terms of ownership than even Alliant. But if we sum up all of the RECs and all of the munis in terms of their ownership, it comes out to 757 megawatts. And so going back to the previous slide in terms of, well, what does that mean? That means that one of those larger plants that previously was shown, collectively, that ownership is the equivalent of one of those larger plants. So that collective ownership equates to a council plus 3. It accounts to basically, if I recall correctly, in fact, if we can move back, we'll just move back. So you see a 757. So that's the equivalent of Ottumwa. It's the equivalent of Walter Scott 3. And it comes basically very close to even looking at sort of Louisa. So it's a very big plant. And think of it like this. Out of 6, one of those is owned by the municipals and the RECs. So what is the resource mix in terms of those 2 investor-owned utilities in Iowa? It has been changing over time. It certainly is showing an increase in wind. over time. But if we look at 2022 results for both Mid-American and Alliant, in the Mid-American case, 64% of the energy that is generated by Mid-American was in fact wind generation. And in fact, coal is the area where it's seen a decrease over time. There still is nuclear. That is a Quad Cities plant that is basically reflected there, and some natural gas, but not a lot of natural gas. On the other hand, Alliant, almost, even pretty close to thirds at this point in time. So 38% in the wind, the natural gas, which they in fact have quite a bit of natural gas, 35% in terms of their overall generation. And again, same thing, coal is decreasing over time. And so for Alliant, you're really seeing sort of a distinction, almost viewed as Alliant is creating a system that is very much sort of a wind natural gas system. Mid-American, very much so looking at mainly a wind and still remaining coal, very little natural gas at this point in time. And what is that generation change? Certainly, it's impressive in terms of wind growth in Iowa. And so if we go back all the way to 2000, where you're going to see that coal was clearly the predominant source. In fact, that point in time where it actually shifted over and changed was 2019, where in the first time in the state, the generation from wind surpassed the generation from coal. And you'll note basically the blue bar showing how coal continues to decline. We have a little bit of a blip, which is actually a reflection of two things. One, you saw a steep decline, which was clearly a pandemic-related decline, but then also saw the rebound from that shortly after. And so now we'll see sort of a stabilizing and a continuing decrease. And again, this was 2022. And I think as we're seeing more wind added, we'll see this to continue to decline, and that wind bar will continue to go up. And I should point out natural gas, which right around 2014 started to take more of, I'll just say, a generation as far as the utilities. And we'll see in a little later slide that that mainly equates to Alliant's use of natural gas. And in fact, this is the slide showing that. So this is charting 2017 through 2022 fossil generation. And so to explain, on the CHOP, the Alliant, on the far right, you have the gas plants. So Emory and Marshalltown and another Marshalltown are all natural gas. Everything on the left side are all coal plants. And again, back to that joint ownership arrangement, where you'll note that both Mid-American and Alliant have bars respectively for the jointly owned plants that they have. But again, Alliant, you'll see a much more aggressive natural gas production than you'll see down at Mid-American. You will note that natural gas is on the increase, both at Alliant and Mid-American. So Mid-American's primary gas plant, which is a combined cycle in Des Moines, is seeing increased utilization over the same time span. You'll also notice the gas, particularly the coal plants, are seeing an overall decline. And in fact, some of them not operating at very high capacity factors at all. So did I skip one there? Nope. Okay. So 100% renewable. I want to address this because clearly there are stated goals that have been pronounced. I'm sure you hear them all the time. You see TV ads on them regarding their 100% renewable. But it's important to understand what we're seeing as far as what that goal really means. And does that mean actually that every hour of the day we're getting renewable energy? And the reality is we are not. So when both Mid-American and Alliant state their goal, what they're saying is that they will generate enough renewable to eventually represent 100% of the Iowa retail customer load. And so what is that? Well, that's important to know. So retail customer load means if you're a customer, you have an electric meter. And so that's what represents their basically goal, is to offset or generate the same amount of renewable as all of their customers. But you'll notice the gold bars on here. The gold bars are the other generation that they basically produce and then sell. And so that's sales to other utilities. And so that is not a part of that 100% goal. When they're saying 100%, they're not saying it's 100% representative of both the retail and the utility sales. It's just the retail sales, which again is this aspect of we're a long ways from being 100% at this point in time. And you'll notice that we see an increase in sales, certainly on Mid-American's side. That's a 122% increase just from 2016 of the amount that's being sold to other utilities. Well, the customer sales, it's certainly a large increase, but it's representing about 35% at this point in time. Alliant, not nearly as aggressive in terms of the growth, but we are seeing increases in terms of utility sales by 19%. Customer sales year to year seems to basically be relatively stable, although in this particular one, it's 2% from that particular look back in time. So what was the generation in 2022 between the two utilities? You'll notice, and this is sort of a reflection of what we just saw previously, Mid-American has quite a bit more. I mean, approaching almost 4 times more as far as the generation compared to Alliant. But what does that breakout? Because that breakout is important in terms of its impact on the environment. And so you'll notice that although wind in both cases is certainly becoming a large portion, that coal generation and the fossil gas generation is still something that, although decreasing, is still a significant amount of the overall generation from both of the utilities. So what is that impact? And so let's look at the emissions then from the coal generation owned by, and I should say owned by, and I mean when I say owned by, it's even though we just referred to Mid-American and Alliant, this has to be attributable back to RECs and municipals also, if they own a part of that. So the plants in toto, meaning the portion of each of these has been segregated just for the two utilities, but when they report these, they also, and depending on the database, it might report all the emissions for a particular plant, or then it's also divvied up based on that ownership interest. Either way, the thing I really want to point out in this, because although sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides will tend to impact the environment, so NOx emissions, if you don't know, will combine with VOCs under sunlight, which is what produces smog. We don't have a lot of days of that, but certainly this contributes to that. And the VOCs, frankly, from the transportation sector is what actually attributes that. Sulfur dioxide, we end up with then deposition of that sulfur dioxide. Certainly that's what the Acid Rain Act was all about, to try and basically reduce sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants. But the one I want to point out is mercury. And although that number looks small in terms of 93 pounds of mercury from this generation, that has a huge impact. That equates to 630 teaspoons of mercury into Iowa's air. Where does it go from there? It comes down, and it basically then deposits in our waterways. And so that amount of mercury is actually enough to contaminate 1.13, or basically 1.1 million acres. And to put that in context, all the surface area of lakes in Iowa would be contaminated 6 times over, just based on that amount of mercury. And what happens once it gets into the lake, mercury doesn't go away. It transforms itself and then basically is consumed by the life, basically the fish, and it's a bioaccumulator. So think of it this way. Every time we deposit more, the fish that we have out there are basically consuming and ending up with more and more and more mercury within the fish tissue itself. And so the externalities basically of this can be quantified. And EPA has done this. They have a model called the COBRA model, standing for the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment Screening Tool. And so we're going to go into talking about then what are the economic impacts of the coal generation and these emissions. And so utilizing the COBRA model, this is the impact. And it's important to note that we may not think that these generating facilities are responsible for much of the emissions in Iowa, but they are. And in fact, in Iowa, these coal plants, and even though they're small in number, they have a mighty impact on the overall emissions in Iowa. So 85% of sulfur dioxide, 58% of nitrogen oxide, 58% of carbon monoxide, 54% of the lead, and 30%, 36% of the particulate matter are just from these very few plants, but they have a huge impact. When that's quantified in terms of what does that represent to our health, it's a high value. That is an annual value of anywhere from $64 million to $145 million per year of adverse health consequences that are the result, again, of these exact same plants. Another consequential aspect of that, and so it's referred to as a social cost of carbon. And so it takes a look at what are, in fact, the impacts and the economic impacts of that from the greenhouse gas emissions that are being emitted. And so in this case, the social cost of carbon has been quantified. And so the most recent value, basically a couple of years ago, was established at $51. The more recent version has said it really should be about $190 per ton. Well, we know what the generation was in terms of how many metric tons of CO2 was emitted by the coal generation in 2022. That was 16.54 million tons. That equates then, using those same dollars and simple multiplication, to anywhere from 844 million to $3.1 billion of impact, and again, on an annual basis from those emissions. And one last quantification in terms of what are the impacts of coal generation. And so for those that have followed the condition of the states that have been done previously, we like to address the aspect that these have an impact on the overall corn production in the state. And so California, Berkeley did a study that looked at the closure of coal plants and then monitored over a 10-year period to see what was the impact on corn yields. And what they established was that, in fact, yields increased after the coal plants closed. So they used that same analysis then to project what type of loss are we seeing from the remaining coal plants. And so in Iowa, if we take a look at the remaining megawatts of coal, it says that anywhere from each county has anywhere from 1 million bushels to 5 million bushels annually of corn loss, or not seeing that production because of the impacts of the coal plants, or the emissions of the coal plants technically. So when we value that, and this is the respective value in terms of what corn was valued at in 2022, that results in anywhere from 452 million to $2.2 billion as far as an impact on corn yields. So what if we take that and sum up the values? What does that actually look like? So if we take a look at then each of those, and so this is just pulling from the previous slides, the total ends up being anywhere from 1.3 billion to 5.5 billion dollars being attributed then economic impacts from that coal generation. So what does that mean in terms of per kilowatt hour? Well, let's just divide that by then the amount of generation from coal generation that occurred in 2022 from those plants. And you're going to see that the actual externality cost is anywhere from 8 cents to 32 cents per kilowatt hour. That is not being accounted for in the cost of what you pay the utility for that energy. And because, again, if I didn't explain, but that's what an externality is something that does not and is not accounted for in the cost or the value you're paying for something. So let's take a look at what does that mean then per plant. And so each of the plants, the green bars, represent what the utilities report to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as a part of their annual FERC Form 1. And you'll see that most of the coal plants are right around the 3.5 cent range as far as what they report. That is their operational cost from that plant. The wind, you'll notice, is lower than that. In fact, that's somewhere right around 2 cents. And the solar farm on there is actually reported at just a little bit above 1 cent per kilowatt hour. But if I add on, then what are those externalities? Well, the wind and the solar don't have externalities. because they don't have emissions. But if I add on those externalities then to the cost from those fossil units, you'll note that it ranges anywhere from basically then about 12 cents per kilowatt hour to up around 35 cents per kilowatt hour from each of those plants. And the true cost from the coal generation, and I think this is important, it's 30 times more expensive than the wind. There really is no justification at this point in time to, let's say, continue to prolong and viewing coal as somehow being the reliable source or the most cost-effective source of energy. So in this condition of the state, decided to take it one step further just to put that into context of what does that mean if you are actually looking at your utility bill and having to account for the actual cost that you're paying. Now, you may not recognize it, but you're paying this cost. You're paying this cost in an increased premium for your health coverage, your increased premiums on your property coverage. All these things are accounted for. It's just you're not accounting for them directly to the utility. You're paying for them in what I characterize as hidden taxes. And so we took a look at Mid-American, Alliant, and then just took a representative REC, Midland Power Cooperative, to sort of see what the impact is from this. And so these are based on actual bills that customers had. So when we took a look at Mid-American, you'll notice that that bill jumped from $66 to $227. That's a 200+ % basically difference as far as utility bills. Same thing for Alliant. That also basically is over a 200% increase as far as what they actually are paying, but just don't recognize they're paying. And then the one that is staggering is the Midland Power Cooperative. That is a 500%. But to put some context in terms of why that one is so large, the cooperatives, most of them anyway, have separate metering programs. And so they provide you a separate meter for usually for your basically heating and air conditioning, if it's electric, as opposed to the meter that's for everything else. They provide an incentive for you to do that. They're electric cooperative, they sell electricity, they don't sell gas, but then that ends up with a situation where your energy usage is quite high. And in this case, this customer used almost 5,700 kilowatt hours. And when you take that into account, again, that produces a much larger bill if you actually are accounting for the hidden taxes, as almost $2,900, which is a huge bill compared to the $458 that you actually are paying the utility. So in conclusion, I want to address sort of these. I'm going to read them right off, but it's clear, we need to recognize that the IPCC reports and the national policy said that to get to net zero, we have to be carbon free in the electricity sector by 2035. No ifs, no ands, no buts. And that's, there's a lot of research, a lot of energy has gone into making these predictions and sort of assessing what do we have to do to ensure we can either stay below that 1.5 or 2 degrees C as far as change. We have the resources to do this. The 100% renewable energy is there. We certainly have the ability to add mechanisms that make interruptible, which is wind and solar, into dispatchable, and with storage. We're not quite there yet, but it certainly is doable. And so all of this is doable. We don't need basically the coal plants. And it's important then to recognize that the coal plants are not just Mid-American and Alliant, that there is ownership interest that spreads across Iowa in terms of the RECs, in terms of the municipals, not all the munis, but certainly a share of them. And again, whether you're a Mid-American, Alliant, a co-op, a muni, your utility bill you're paying is just a fraction of what you end up paying every single year, and will continue to pay every single year as long as we continue to operate the jointly owned coal unit. With that, pass it to Marshall.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. So as we see up there, we have some additional resources. We're going to put a recording of this up on our IEC's YouTube channel. We'll be emailing you out links to that. We want to have time for some Q&A here, but our website, iaenvironment.org, has lots of good resources. And of course, it has the condition of the state report that includes a more detailed breakdown of all the information that Steve just shared with us. So, Steve, we had two questions in the chat that I'll go right to, and then we can open it up to see if anybody else has any questions. But Kay Pence asked about solar. Do we have data on the solar mix in Iowa?
The number of megawatts?
Or just what the mix is like? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, in terms of the slides that showed the mix, I'm hoping that we'll start to show a little more, but at a utility scale, there's only about 150 megawatts of solar right now. And so it's a blip on those graphs. And then those two pie charts, those were representations of the two utilities themselves. They both will start to show a little bit more in there, but right now it's so small it doesn't even show up on the pie chart.
Okay, great. And then Russ Stammer asked about, do you have a way to express the loss in crop value as a expression of dollars per acre?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would do that is I would take the values that were derived, and that's divided by so the number of corn acres every year is recorded, and you can find that obviously um, on the state databases as far as how much corn went in. So yes, I would just take the two and divide that. I have not done that, but that is certainly one way to do it.
Okay. Let's see. In the chat, we have Donald Com asks, what are your thoughts on the carbon capture pipelines being proposed? Do they factor into this report?
Yeah. Hi, Don. I'll say no. They don't. Um, Certainly, the report is based on the concept that we should be able to get to a carbon-free, 100% carbon-free sector. If we take a look at the IPCC reports, they will tell us that the pipelines will be necessary. But when they look at those, and again, recognize that's looking at worldwide, but they're also looking at the pipelines as more of a solution to these very hard to decarbonize industrial sectors. They're not necessarily looking at that in terms of a way to decarbonize generation. Um, Personally, do I think that that has a value in terms of Iowa generation? I don't, and I look at that from the perspective of how far we've already gone as far as the percentage of our renewables, and recognizing that of all the states, we're probably at a point where we have the least distance to go to actually make that transition.
Yeah, great. We have Mark asked, he's interested in renewable backup. If we dropped out of coal, is the gas backup strong enough to do it all? I guess he's referring to gas as like our peaker capability.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, um, even if we take a look at the most recent EPA proposal to address carbon emissions in the generation sector, that is certainly why when you look at what they've done as far as when you have to implement carbon controls, that they have allowed the gas generation sector to be further out in time, because they see it as a transitional phase where the coal units will go out first, and then you still allow the gas sector to basically not control as soon. It has to be controlled, but not control as soon, recognizing that there is in fact a benefit because of a reduced amount of CO2 per megawatt hour that I get from gas.
All right. Let's see. Jim asks,
Does IEC advocate for securitization as a tool to more rapidly get retired coal plant assets off the backs of ratepayers?
We advocate, I believe, for the ability to have securitization as a statutory and legislative tool. Whether or not entities actually utilize that is clearly going to be up to that respective entity. I mean, if it basically provides them the ability to provide a lower cost of service to customers, then yes, they should be encouraged to do so. But yes, I mean, recognizing you have to have legislation to actually do that. And so we clearly support legislation that would do that.
Okay, great. And then Mark follows up. So can we drop out coal now and still back up our wind fleet? So I guess it's like, what were to happen if all the coal plants shuttered in the next 2 years? What if we had no coal by 2025 or 2030? I know is one thing that IEC we talk a lot about how 2035 is the definite deadline, but we really feel like Iowa's fleet could be retired by 2030. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So let's start back at the aspect of the initial question as far as all of it today. Simple answer, no. Could we get by with less? I believe so. If we take a look at the capacity factors, or in other words, so each plant operates a certain amount of time during the year, and it's referred to as a capacity factor. And if you basically sum up the capacity, the amount of generation needed, and then those plants that could basically provide that, yes, I think at this point in time, we clearly could shift some of that generation to other plants that are operating less and close at least one, probably two, even at this point in time. As far as the trajectory of how do we get there, we absolutely need to look at it as saying, well, I need something else on the system that has the ability to then provide the energy that, again, balances my interruptible sources. I can do that one of two ways. We're working on transmission. Clearly, transmission has the ability to then facilitate that. So my wind farm up in North Dakota at some point should be able to then fill in that gap that we may have currently. The other way it occurs is looking more locally. And so as I look at my resources, I need to have storage on the system also. And although I know we're starting to make that trend, those are the two elements that we need to focus on to bring us to that point where we, in fact, can close the plants. Simple answer today, no, we can't get rid of them all, but we need to have a plan. We need to have a plan that basically has us on a trajectory that recognizes that we can't run the plants till 2050, and we have to have a plan in place to get to, and should have a plan in place that at least provides an analysis of, well, what if we close the plants by 2030? You know, what if we did this? How will we get there? But we don't have that plan right now, and that is what's missing.
So does this then factor into the rate making study that's going on at the IUB and the push for an integrated resource plan?
It certainly should, yeah, because it's only through integrated resource planning that we can analyze these sort of not only events, but the uncertainties, and sort of, again, chart a course. An IRP is intended to be an iterative process. And so the states that have them, it's not a static document. You continually reanalyze over time how you're going to address the future. But an IRP does that and provides then a mechanism that is intended to be most cost effective for the customer. And I think that's a critical point that needs to be made. Anything we do should be for the customer. And so should bring us back to a point in time where we focus on how do I basically deliver energy not only cost effectively, but hopefully at a lower cost to customers. And I do that when I have an IRP, which allows me to assess my overall fleet and basically how do I then meet the future demand in a cost effective and environmentally responsible manner.
Yeah, so I think this is good time to draw attention to. You can see on your screen, we have an upcoming webinar on the 16th of October. As many of you folks may know now, and getting to Mark's follow-up question here, the Iowa Utilities Board is currently undergoing a study of how to update the rate-making rules and then make recommendations to the state in the next legislative session. So currently, a bunch of folks who are involved in utilities, in research, in the legal side. IEC is involved in these rate making studies going on at the Iowa Utilities Board. And so the webinar that we're going to be having on the 16th of October will be letting folks know, explaining what's going on at the Iowa Utilities Board, what this process is looking like. Because Mark asked the follow-up question, are the utilities on the hook to do such integrated planning? And the answer is no. Right now, they're not, which makes Iowa a bit of an outlier. Most other states do require their monopolies to have integrated resource planning. And it's something that not only do ratepayers want, but also industry wants. Pretty much anyone who isn't the utility wants this because it gives a certain amount of predictability. It allows people to know what the future is looking like. And so I know IEC, we're definitely advocating that integrated planning should be mandated on the utilities. And so that's a lot of what we are advocating for in this rate making study going on at the Utilities Board. And we'll definitely be able to present a lot more information to y'all at our Flip the Switch webinar on October 16th. Mark asks, are comments to the IUB the best way to press for this? I think at this stage, yes, comments definitely help. If you want to send comments to the IUB, also to your state representatives. We definitely are right now pushing. The state representatives, the state legislature will be taking this up in the next legislative session, and several of the legislators probably do not know that it is coming up on their plate. We want to make sure that they are all informed that integrated resource planning is something that citizens, businesses, municipalities are concerned about and want. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to the IUB and reaching out to your state representatives and let them know that you are concerned about integrated resource planning for sure. Let's see, Joel Zook says, I had assumed that coal plants were indirectly, through climate change, affecting corn production. The study you mentioned made it seem like the cessation of burning coal has a positive near-term and local effect on corn production. What is the mechanism for coal plants affecting corn production? SOX, NOx, etc.
Yeah, so Joel, all of the above. So the hypothesis is that all the emissions effectively, think of it like this, that they're blocking sun. And so when I put sulfate or nitrates or particulate matter, I'm not allowing all the sun to come through. And so if I reduce the sun, I'm reducing basically the production process within the corn plant itself. The study, by the way, originally looked at both corn and soybeans, but then determined that soybeans were not being impacted by the coal production. By the way, the 10 years study I was talking about in terms of looking at plant coal closures included the plants in Iowa. So the Neal plants, Neal 1, Neal 2, the Council Bluff plants, Council Bluffs 1 and 2, now called Walter Scott, were all a part of that. And so they determined that, in fact, the range of impact is 200 kilometers from these plants. And so those plants in particular definitely had an impact in showing results in Iowa. And again, sort of how they then took that demonstrated increase in production, but then could basically view that as, well, again, if I had this increase in production, then I can in essence make the same conclusion that the continued production is being lost or impacted by remaining generation. But the theory is that it's impacting basically the amount of sun.
Amy asked if we could post a link to the corn study. So I believe all the research that is part of this report is in the end notes of the report, which I just linked again. But the section about crop yields starts on page 13, which is all the pages are hyperlinked in the table of contents. And you should be able to go to the footnotes there, and it links like Iowa State had a thing, a study on cash corn and soybean prices and how they were being affected.
So, Amy, you can also go back because all the generation of the basically condition of the states are online on the IEC site. If you go back to the 2020 version, I believe that's where you'll find a more in-depth discussion of the impact on corn yields.
All right. Well, I will just highlight again, we've got some more events coming up later this year. In addition to that webinar, we have our Wild Scenic Film Festival in November. But I definitely recommend if this webinar was of interest to you, definitely check out our webinar on the 16th of October, where we'll be able to give you lots of updates. We'll still be in the middle of the rate making study, so your feedback and questions there could help impact how we show up in the rate making. So definitely check it out. You can register at iaenvironment.org/events. And yeah, so we'll be sending out a recording of this. We'll be hosting on YouTube and sending it out to all of y'all in a follow-up thank you email. So I want to thank you all for showing up and showing interest in the state of electric generation in Iowa.